Hello, folks, and welcome to the podcast. In today's interview, I'm going to talk to Jeff Wanner, founder of PairPEO. I met Jeff a while back when he wanted to sell me benefits at Level. We already had a strong relationship on this front, and I told him as much. He understood and asked if we could stay in touch. Fast forward probably 4 or 5 years, and I've been introduced to at least 30 awesome people by him, and I've made a handful of introductions for him. I consider Jeff a friend. And I also got a great deal on benefits for Defiance. So thanks for that, Jeff. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me today.
Appreciate you having me, man.
Great. So I want to dig into what you do for a living, but also on how you go about networking, because I think you're one of the best in the business at it. So first off, can you please tell the listeners what PairPEO does?
Sure. We broker out the PEO industry. So the natural question is going to be, what the heck is a PEO? PEO is a professional employer organization. Essentially what it is a big company employing small companies, so small companies have access to big company buying power and benefits. Most of the industry has been birthed through this inflationary decade and a half of healthcare reform and large medical prices going up and up and up. You partner with the PEO, so you get a couple 100,000 people worth of buying power, drive those costs back to where they were probably a decade ago, and keep a really solid foundation for growth for any business that wants to employ people and be competitive.
It's interesting because I've heard of PEOs being used for other benefits as well. For instance, a company I know wanted to expand internationally, and due to COVID, they couldn't. The offices weren't available in this country. People weren't coming into work to form the new entity so that they could do business there. So they just signed on with the PEO. They bought the benefits through them, but the real reason that they did it was just they couldn't get through the paperwork. So.
Yeah, and that's a fairly common practice for any international company that wants to come to the U.S. Our laws and restrictions for employment are rather ever-changing and just frustrating for other countries. So it's a very common practice for international companies that find a domestic footprint and have a very competitive benefit package that's going to help them hire the right type of people to really take their domestic presence, to market.
Oh, that's great. So how did you get involved with PEOs?
By accident. I think that everybody that gets involved with PEOs gets involved by accident. You don't ever intentionally go into this outsourced HR, benefit, payroll, workers' comp solution space, but I had been working from home, rewind 7 years ago, I'd worked from home, opened a remote office for a value-added reselling tech firm, sold mostly to K-12, desktops, laptops, super simple stuff for a person that's not technically sound to understand. So I was doing that for a couple of years, and I realized that Charlotte was going to be home for me forever. I loved it being down here, coming from Northeast Ohio. I just saw it as this is where I would want to establish my roots, grow my network. And at that point, sales to me had always been a pick up the phone, dial as much as you can. It's going to be a volume game, and eventually you're going to find yourself into some wins. And when I came over to Insperity, they had a much more methodical approach to the way that you generate business and you develop relationships and create strategic partnerships. And so that's really what drew me to them. Whenever I went into the interview process, I had no idea what I was interviewing for at first. After the first round, I was like, okay, I'm going to really prepare for the second one, and ended up being employed with Insperity for a good 4 years, who's a market leader in the PEO space.
And was Insperity the first, or they just did it better than anybody else? Because I had heard their name even before I got introduced to you.
Yeah, Insperity was. It's funny because there's a lot of claim about who was the first PEO, and Insperity certainly through the employment process iterates that they were the first PEO to come to be. Their founder and CEO, who's still their founder and CEO today, 35 years later, Paul Servati, started the business because he had started several businesses and kind of got to that point where they just got frustrated with all of the administrivia of having employees. When you go into business for yourself, you're trying to do something specific for your clients. And then eventually you go into the business of having employees, which is a business in and of itself. So he thought, well, why don't I co-employ with all these small businesses that hit this tipping point, help them push through so they're not kind of buried in the administrivia of HR, and they can focus on what they do well, their core competency, their people, and their growth.
That's brilliant. So were they PEOs back then, 35 years ago, or was it something else? And then laws changed. And
there was a term used. Employee leasing was a very common vernacular used for the PEO market back then. I'm not sure exactly when the rebrand happened for PEOs, but obviously I worked it into my company's name, so I feel like it's a name that's going to stick around, or an acronym that will stick around for some time.
If you decide that you need to change it, I've been involved with 4 companies who have changed their names.
Perfect.
Or 3. I take that back, 3. So try to avoid it if you can.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, wow, so 35 years ago. Now, do you know, were there changes in U.S. law that gave rise to this notion of PEO, or was it just something where people started to realize, hey, there's got to be a better way to pool resources?
Right. And it's honestly, that was all an accident or a happy coincidence, we'll say, because the PEO market as a whole was grown to alleviate the need for all these, state-to-state compliance, understanding the ever-changing workforce from just a regulation and just complexity perspective. Well, fast forward, they started co-employing with all of these different, small businesses, and they're like, well, we have tons of buying power now. And there's this element of every small business is healthcare, which wasn't all that inflationary for a very long time. And then the last couple of decades has become enormously inflationary, which drove a lot of attention and eyes to that line item on these balance sheets. And so PEOs are like, okay, we have all this buying power. We can go to market for our 5 to 10 to 50 person companies with hundreds of thousands of people of buying power. So we can pull these rates down, which ultimately now has become the reason that people partner with PEOs, is because you can pull that healthcare premium number down. You can deliver it digitally and effectively, and it's going to overpay for what the administrative fees are to actually run the co-employment relationship that it was originally meant to do.
Do you see a moment or the potential for people to do the same thing for individual consumers, or is there just something inherent about employers that makes it much more feasible?
I can definitely see a market. I mean, I think look at the co-working spaces with solopreneurs who are always going to be solopreneurs that are trying to go to market for their own personal care for them and their families. I think that's a space that is worth consideration. But most PEOs want you to have, 3 to 4 employees on your book. They want to have some sort of administrative revenue tied to you. So I don't think an existing PEO is going to chase after that business, but I think that a new PEO certainly could attack that solopreneur space, which is becoming more and more prevalent as people are betting on themselves and becoming more of self-employed and not going down the traditional means of creating income.
Very, very interesting. So you're working for Insperity. I recall you were doing very well with it. When did you know that you wanted to go out on your own? Was there a single aha moment?
It's funny. I don't know that there was an actual aha moment. It was a pattern of consistent opportunities that I ran, and it kind of goes back to what my strengths are, or identifying good opportunities and making recommendations for things that I think that I would actually do. And so I had a lot of rooms I was in with Jeff when I was Jeff at Insperity that I was just overkill for. Insperity tends to be a very expensive solution when it comes to administrative fees, but when you can make the medical premiums come down far enough to justify it, it's easy to make that recommendation. But a lot of times that wasn't the reality I was having for my clients. And so I would position them and say, okay, use my quotes, go out and find somebody else that's going to do this for half the administrative fees, and you'll end up being in a better relationship, which is, again, what ended up birthing my business model in its early infancy. But I was probably 2 years into Insperity whenever I realized that nobody knows how to buy this thing. Everyone needs help asking the right questions. Everybody you can get a lot of concessions if you know what you're asking for. And then basically that was what PairPEO ended up being, is someone that's going to get on my client side of the table, have their best interests at heart, and help them into relationships that I would actually do myself if I was in their seat.
Yeah, from having worked with you at PairPEO but not in Insperity, I feel like there's a story about some U.S. president. I've butchered it multiple times on this podcast, but was asked, I believe it was Lincoln or Washington, was asked, if you had a week to chop down a tree, how would you go about it? And he says, well, I'd spend 6 days sharpening the blade and then take it down. And I felt like with you, that was very much the experience. We gave you all the data that we would give to an Insperity or to any other competitor, but you asked us a lot of questions and said, hey, could we structure this way? Can we position it this way? To the point where when we finally did when we actually submitted all the data to the different providers, it was a real quick process. You said, yeah, nobody's going to beat this price. This is good. Let's lock it in. This is what we want to do. So I think it's that upfront prep work. And you understand why an Insperity or any of their competitors would spend so much energy, because all the other things that they're doing are really hard and a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of red tape, right? But it's probably not the same skill set that can navigate that side of it. That's the skill set that is, how do I actually figure out how to get the best pricing for my customers?
Yeah, it's such a fickle industry, and I feel like a lot of times my clients don't understand why I'm asking questions I'm asking. In a broker seat, like, you want all of the information, because ultimately what you're doing is you're telling a story to the PEOs. They're not underwriting you, in traditional ways that a traditional healthcare broker would underwrite you, where your pricing with one broker is going to be exactly the same with every other broker you're working with. And the PEOs look at your business and like, do we want to bring this on? So it's a lot of storytelling. And for a company like Defiance, who's got a lot of long-winded future opportunity tied to it through acquisitions and through other things, I can tell that story to a company like Insperity and say, here's why you want this business. Here's why your numbers need to look a lot better if you want to get it, and have them justify the price points that you get. So it becomes this, I'm not really selling to my clients. I'm selling to the PEOs as to why they want my clients. The numbers come back in a way that justify my relationship.
Interesting. So you really become an aggregator of supply and demand, right? The more of these PEOs that you sign up, the more supply you've got, and you've got the demand from your clients. That's really interesting. What do you think prevented you from going out on your own before? Was it just something you had never thought about, or were there doubts? Were there?
The answer is no. I've always thought about it. I feel like I'm not a good corporate employee. I found that when you're so used to seeing problems over and over and persisting over and over again, and you know that no matter how long or how hard you pound the desk, nothing's going to really change in your lifetime inside that giant organization. It gets super frustrating. And so even before I'd started PairPEO, when I was doing value-added reselling on the tech side, I wanted to go on the business for myself in that world too. It didn't end up coming to fruition. I mean, I was 24 years old at the time. You have a lot of hope, but you don't have a lot of experience at that point in your life. And when I was at Insperity, it really was, 2 years into it, and then 2 years to really make that jump. And really for me, like, it was my wife or my fiance at the time was saying, we want to start a family. You've been talking about going into business for yourself for 5+ years. If you don't do this right now, we're going to have kids. You're going to have every excuse in the book to enjoy your cushy job, making the money you're making and working, having the stress level that you have, and not being able to actually branch away from that and take a chance on yourself. So it really came down to her being that straw that was pushing me out at the right time to be able to, confidently go into this venture of betting on myself.
So there's some things that people have to do whenever they start a business that some people do struggle with. There's the legal aspects, the company formation and structuring the company. There's setting up accounting books. There's things like that. They're setting up payroll and setting up a bank account and all of that. Was that all stuff that you found pretty easy to do, or did you know people who had already done it?
The beauty of being in small business advisory is that you get a lot of friends that do things that you're going to need to run your own small business. So I have been so blessed with great legal counsel that's very pro bono. That's very much contingent upon me buying him a drink or whatever whenever I see him, but he refuses to invoice me. Great bookkeeping / accounting resources.
I have a good audio video guy who likes to do that for alcohol. So.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Yeah. And so like you start getting this circle of people that have all done it. And I attribute really part of my launching point to doing mastermind groups with other people that have done it and that are in the same kind of age bracket, that had the same types of mental hurdles they needed to overcome to actually do it. So the interesting thing is that my business needed revenue before I had any of those problems. We were living off my wife's CMS salary for a good 12 plus months, which is super humbling, but it really taught me to not overextend what I needed and kind of live by our bare bones. And again, those advisors that came across my network through Insperity's dime, really kind of creating those relationships, were really the catalyst for me to be able to hit the ground running and not look back.
That's awesome. So for anybody contemplating going out on their own in any industry, what advice do you have for them now that you've been at this for a little bit and are seeing the growth and the stability is there? And
and you're absolutely right. Like the corporate security blanket is such a propaganda in so many ways. But I would tell them that talk about it with your clients. I mean, I had so many conversations, just candid conversations about what I thought I was going to do, where the value was going to be. Test your hypotheses on your employer's dime and make sure that you know where you're going to find your first dollar, because that's a big part of it all. And when you start stacking wins, just any networking relationship, any partnership I've ever had, the first win is always the hardest one. So try to envision what that's going to look like for you and your business and who that first win's going to be, because replicating a win is very easy. Finding the first win is very hard. So do that on somebody else's dime.
Mm-hmm. So I think I understand or probably have a feel for this answer, but how'd you go about getting that first, not just the first customer, but the first 3 or 4? I agree that the first is the hardest, but I still think there's some number that is hard, and then it really starts to get exponentially easier.
For me, it was very easy because I was basically performing my business model for 2 years under Insperity, because I knew when I was a good fit, whenever I was with a client that I was getting great pricing for, and the numbers really made sense. So like I would walk myself out of doors when that wasn't the case. And so whenever I decided to go off on my own, those are the first doors I went and knocked on. There's zero conflict of interest. It's not existing Insperity business. So I can go back and have the dialogue with them. They know I'm going to give them sound advice because I told them not to go with me 2 years earlier, and they can bring me in to go audit what they're doing currently, which is probably something I told them to do 2 years before. So that was the easiest path for me, is just be mindful that, you're not always the right fit. Don't look at the short-term gain as if it's the end-all be-all. And when you're inside of a corporate machine, it's really hard not to see every deal as this is why this deal makes sense for this reason and this reason only, and ignore everything else that's going on, why it wouldn't make sense for a client.
That's interesting. So it sounds like you'd counsel authenticity too, because in your day job, having that authenticity is what established you as, hey, this person actually cares and is going to create a win-win situation here.
Yeah, I'd say that I've made a very big habit of being very much myself in every situation, and I think that that's a very important part to having people be your champion. If you're not out just pretending you know everything and you want to be the best fit for every single situation, you can perform really great in those roles. You can make a lot of money being a top sales producer for your organization if that's your path. But for me, again, it took too much out of my intrinsic motivation to tell people to do things that I wouldn't do. And again, when you go into this independent broker seat, you're able to always make recommendations to things that you would do. Even if it doesn't pay you today, you can still play the long game and make sure you're seen as an ally to those entrepreneurs that you're supporting.
So you mentioned the first handful of customers were existing prospects that you'd been working with. How much more sophisticated has that process gotten now?
It's interesting because I do, and this is not a good answer, I don't think, for people that don't have a network during COVID, because you're not going to get a network overnight through the pandemic. But I do everything through introduction. Everything that gets on my calendar happened just how me and you met. Garth Moulton shot you a text, said, hey, you should meet with Jeff. I went into that conversation. I go into every conversation assuming that nothing's going to happen. Like, people don't really care what you do. They care about who you are, is what I've realized with most of my networking. So you create friendships and stuff that are going to help propel you into other conversations. So my biggest champions now are my clients and my strategic partners that are going to be, your fractional C-suites and CPA firms. And so my sophistication, there it is, of my like my go to market and my prospecting is just to find good partners that understand what I do, how it can be impactful for their client base, and put me into the right conversations at the right time.
That's great. That'll serve you for a long time for sure. We at Level we grew that way for probably the first 3 years of our existence, and it continued to be a source of growth. Although we did invest in some less organic, more repeatable things that aren't as reliant strictly on the network.
I'm learning that now that I've hired a guy out in Dallas, Texas, and trying to understand that, trying to use my model in his market is impossible. And so there's got to be other ways to be able to generate business as I start scaling the business into new markets.
That's interesting. Do you think it's because Dallas is such bigger of a city than Charlotte? Because I always say that we're almost the perfect size city because it's small enough where you can know everybody,
Right?
but it's big enough where that's a meaningful number.
Right. I think that it goes back down to mindset. So the guy I hired, he was in my training with me at Insperity, 6 years ago now. And then he always outperformed me at the Insperity level. He ended up finding a job with a startup that was not figuring out their compensation model yet, which I'm sure that you fall victim to this too, where all of a sudden you're cutting out $100,000 quarterly checks to your business development people because your goals are way too small. And then VCs came in and cut his commissions by about 90%. And he's like, this probably isn't the best fit for him. So he basically sat dormant through 2020, just enjoying the fruits of his labor. And we had a dialogue about, where he was at, what he was interviewing for. And I'm just like, why don't you come do what I'm doing? You always did really great selling this direct. Now you're not really selling it. You're just helping people buy it. And it's a much more enjoyable relationship, in my opinion. So that's why we brought him in. And again, if he had the network that I had, he could have a very easy pipeline to be able to lean on, and he's already starting to prove that that's part of what his strategy is going to be, but he's going to have to hit some traditional lead gen tactics that I just haven't had to put myself through yet.
But that's a good point that we're going to revisit later is the networking. You might not have known the value of the networking you were doing beforehand, or maybe you did, but either way, you were glad that you had it and put in that investment. Do you know the lifetime value of your average customer? It seems like it would be pretty high to me.
Well,
I'm not asking you the specific dollar amount, but
it's obviously my company's in its infancy right now. So as I was making this first hire, I was having I was having the devil and the angel shoulder conversation about, do I hire for sales or do I hire for retention? And then I looked at my book and I'm like, we have not lost anything ever when it comes to clients that have come on board with us and that are still residual revenue clients for our organization. So really, I think it's impossible for me to say definitively. I would expect that most of my attrition is going to happen through acquisition. Mm-hmm. People get acquired. They want to put their own vendors and support systems in place, and that's a pretty normal attritionable moment for my industry. But most of my clients that are utilizing me to help them make better decisions about the partnerships that they're in from the PEOs, they're going to have me help them make run new RFPs, run new parallel financial analysis on their existing relationship versus the market. So clients that are clients of mine today should, in theory, be clients of mine, 5-10 years from now, assuming they haven't sold and still exist or haven't changed hands.
So is there a point where you outgrow the need for a PEO, short of becoming HP or Ford?
It's very unique because I always saw PEO clients as the sub 100, 150 groups that had, there's a couple of different variables when it comes to what a good PEO client looks like. But in the last 6 months, I brought on a 500 person group, mm-hmm. 1,000 person group. So my hypothesis has changed, and what I thought was true is not true. So those bigger groups, what happens is that you can bring on a group that's of that size that is having a big time trouble containing the healthcare cost equation of their business, and they maybe have a 10-person HR department. If you're going to hire a PEO, you're really only going to need a handful of people in your HR department. So really, they can justify the cost of a PEO's administrative fees if they're going to have a big reduction in healthcare spend, a big reduction in workers' comp spend, and then a potential reduction in headcount in their HR department. So I'd say that you can outgrow a PEO, much smaller than that. If you're a 50 employee group that's all young, early 30-year-old men, like that group would probably do a heck of a lot better on the open market medical, when we're talking about medical premiums, than inside of a PEO. So it just depends on the demographics of the group and the experience that they've had with their HR department.
So you talked a little bit about some scaling efforts that you've made to date. You mentioned a geographic scaling. How do you think about scaling this business? Is it geographic? Is it getting into more less organic kind of digital marketing related things and building top of funnel, some combination?
So I think and obviously I'm super biased because of how I built this business here, and in the way that my revenue model works right now, it is so heavy around the 485 loop that I saw that as the only way I can grow another market is to have boots on the ground and basically having them manage that market. I've bounced around some ideas around franchising and things that I could do in the long run. And obviously the fun part about starting a company, and it's less than 2 years old, is that you don't know where you're ultimately going to land on that scaling expedition that you have ahead of you. But I think that, hiring Matt in Dallas is a great template for me to either figure out, okay, how long does it take for him to really bring me money to pay for his salary, pay for his benefits, and to be able to actually produce something for the company. And when he does that, I'm able to double down, go find 2 more markets. And so right now my hypothesis is that we replicate off of his production, whether or not where our break-even point is going to be and how long it'll take us to be able to multiply markets in that fashion. And the scale internally will be mostly an HQ. Charlotte will always be the home of PairPEO as long as I'm running it, and the administrative services and stuff will come out of here. So as he comes on and retention does become an issue, that's when we're hiring up client success directors that are going to have another 2 or 3 people underneath them here in the Charlotte market.
That's great. What do you think most small business owners get wrong when they think about benefits?
I think that most small business owners don't care. I mean, they want something that's going to help them attract and retain the right type of talent, but nobody's a student of benefits in a entrepreneurial sense. They don't want to be. They do something well. It's a very confusing topic, and there's a lot of different ways to consume it. And I think that the thing that I think that's generally what I've seen with most small business owners. So I think the PEO strategy is they kind of give you a out of the box solution. It's got 4 or 5 plans in your benefit strategy, and it's going to basically help you with your baby boomers all the way down to your Gen Zers that you have employed inside your organization. So it kind of solves the problem of what do I put in place that helps everybody when you can't really put one thing in place that helps everybody inside of a PEO. Obviously, you're going to have that varying degree of benefit offering. So, I think it's just one of those things that it's a necessity, which is great for me, but it's not something that anybody gets all that excited about.
That's for sure. Are there certain industries you try to go after or that you do better with, or is it really just more about the size and needs of the business?
Well, remember, John, I do everything through intro. So if you saw my client base, there would be no pattern whatsoever outside of the fact that they want to have healthcare in place.
Okay. So
I work with 2-person employers because now I'm a 3-person employer because I do employ my wife per the advice of my CPA. But I'll work with small groups like that are just trying to get off the open market exchange, which is ridiculously priced, very bad benefit coverage. They want to make their 3rd, 4th, and 5th hire. So they turn a key. Now they're market competitive to be able to go do that. So it all just depends on what I get introduced into and where I see my fit.
That's great. So do you partner with other service providers? I would imagine accountants or tenant reps on the commercial real estate side. Are there other types of service providers who can help you out and you can help them out?
Yeah, I've been pretty intentional about, and CPA firms are great in theory. CPAs are generally very conservative in nature, so they're not necessarily going to endorse something they don't fully understand, but you can have a lot of success with CPA firms that look at a client or look at a portfolio of their clients that have a certain amount of dollars going out the door to UHC, United Healthcare, or Blue Cross Blue Shield, or Aetna, and you can back into, okay, will this introduction be economically interesting to my clients? But I also work with fractional CFOs who usually have more of an intimate relationship with 5-6 clients. Fractional CHROs are fantastic because these PEOs really are a tactical HR solution that's going to cover your benefits, payroll, all the things you kind of have to do to have people and pay them. And these fractional HR leaders are generally doing things that are more specific to revenue generation, culture, and things that are going to really affect the top line revenue of the organization. So those are great partners for me as well. I used to work a lot with benefit brokers. Now in my space, it's very hard for me to make them whole. What I found is that people don't want to take money out of their own pocket, even if it makes more sense for their clients. So healthcare brokers will generally only bring me in if they're going to lose a client to a PEO.
Okay.
And they'll use me as more of as a way to divert that revenue to a PEO that I'd be recommending.
So are there any currently proposed changes in legislation that impact benefits?
As a whole, I mean, obviously the big scary monster is the universal healthcare concept. What I kind of use the United States as a metaphor. I mean, obviously hundreds of years ago, we were a startup country and we had a lot of agility to do the things that we want to do right now, but we're not going to be able to do as big as we've become. So I think a lot of that stuff that is around universal healthcare would be directed at the individual level, but companies would still have a package that would be used to attract and retain top talent. So do I feel like I'm completely inexposed in that area? No, but I don't think that it's realistic to expect anything to happen in a 5 to 10 year window.
It's interesting you mentioned that because we did some business and had some employees in the UK at Level, and they have a healthcare system, but there's a certain level of seniority at which there's an expectation of some private to supplement it, and especially with the long history that we have here of private insurance, it seems like there would always be some supplemental offerings there. So
it seems like it would be awfully optimistic to assume that something that like a Canadian universal healthcare system could work in a country as big as ours that has as many opinions as ours has. But again, that's probably the biggest glaring piece of legislation that would heavily disrupt the industry.
So what do you think is more important to the growth of your business, growing revenue per customer or finding new customers? It sounds like the churn's a big driver, which is more of growing revenue per customer or not losing it. But is finding new logos more important or cultivating the ones that you already have?
I think that finding new logos is going to always take a precedence just because of the stickiness of the relationships that I have with clients that I'm engaged with. The revenue model is tied to a per employee, per head, or per month payout. So as Defiance becomes a 100-person company, you've just become 5x as valuable to me as you were whenever, like whatever you are now, 18, 20 employees. Mm-hmm. So like I'm going to organically grow revenue as my clients succeed. So that's a piece of my, like, if I did nothing else between now and the end of the year, I will likely have higher revenue in December of 2021 than I do right now, just because of that growth that's going to happen organically across my client base. So adding new people to that pie is very important. Mm-hmm. And it's also, for me, like, it's interesting because I love working with 5-person companies because they generally have something I can sell. Mm-hmm. Like, make some introductions for help the revenue line item of their business. But a 5-person company turning into a 50-person company, just 10x my revenue on them.
Wow.
My impact or my involvement in my bandwidth is really tied to that first interaction, helping them go through the process of evaluating PEOs, place them with one that's going to put a competitive offering in there, and then help them transition as time goes on, where their needs may change, their administrative fees may get excessive, and we need to make a pivot just to be able to keep their incumbent at bay. And you fast forward a couple of years, it's a heck of an ROI.
So you mentioned the upfront cost that you have to spend with them. Do you have is open enrollment a big deal in terms of impacting your life the way that, say, tax filing is in April for a CPA?
Sure. Yeah, it definitely is. So the industry does a lot of great things for brokers, not intentionally at all, but it's really great for us because we know when these renewals happen, so we can proactively shop all of our clients. And so if I have a client, half of my, like a lot of my book will renew on either 10/1 or 11/1. 100% of their clients renew those dates. So I know that I need to shop these guys out in July. And July is a dead time in a lot of industries. And so you run some competitive numbers and you make sure that, okay, if they are going to get hit with a 20% increase or something, we have something that's based off of last year's numbers. All these PEOs understand that we have to create a compelling reason for them to change providers. So basically, if they get a 20% increase, the proposals I'll have ready for them to go are going to be probably 30, 40% below what that increase looks like, which gives us a tremendous leverage to be able to go back to that incumbent, get better pricing, or pivot to a new provider if they're not willing to come down in a way that's meaningful enough. Does that make sense?
It totally does, actually. It's just crazy to me that you can save 30 to 40% on these costs because they're non-trivial costs.
Right.
Even at our size of 20 people, it's a non-trivial cost. But I guess the commentary that screams to me that we have a very inefficient market. If a competitor, I mean that should be arbitraged out in theory.
So in theory, yes, but so you got to think about every single one of these PEOs is measured on new business. So everyone I work with inside these PEOs is measured on new business. And so they know that if they want you to come from Insperity, go to their organization, go through the pain of transitioning,
Play to win. Yep.
They know that they have to make it really lucrative for you to do it. Well, if you get hit with a big increase and they've already made it really interesting for you to do it, now you got an increase on top of it, that stacks up a very compelling case for you to make a transition or for you to go back to Insperity and say, hey, listen, we got this in the open market, or we got this in the competitive market. We're going to make a move if you guys can't match this. It gives you a ton of leverage back in that equation.
So you mentioned the July cycle where you're not that busy, so you're out doing the competitive research. What other things do you do when you're not in your busy season to make sure that you're as busy as possible during the busy season?
I'd say that I thought that there was a dead season in this industry, and it hasn't existed for the last 13, 14 months. Usually at the turn of the quarter, and maybe this is just kind of the sales lethargic space that you end up playing in, is that once the calendar year turns, you're like, okay, I had a great year, I'm moving, I'm just kind of going to take my time going back into building my pipeline back up. But this year Q1 was stronger than Q4, which is very weird for the industry. So I'm hoping that's the norm for me, that all these quarters end up having a lot of opportunity to continue to put more production into the business. But what I was hoping for was a lot of lulls in the business, because it allows me to work on the business very, very intently during times when things are not as fast-paced and furious. So I'd say that some of the big triggering points in the industry, ADP renews 100% of their clients on 6/1. So ADP is the largest market share holder because they obviously have a payroll solution that is an industry leader that they upsell into their PEO product. So right now I'm dealing with a lot of ADP clients that are wanting to kick the tires, see what else is out there. Some of those clients are happy with ADP and they just want me to go run a competitive RFP, type up some emails for them, send it out to ADP, watch their pricing come down, which is another model that I deployed through COVID because people weren't willing to make a change when there was so much already changing in our marketplace. So I would do a contract negotiation for them, take a 25% commission off of their reduction in fee structure. So they have no disruption to their business at all, no transition needed. And then I would just get compensated for a contingent model where I'm not only getting paid if I'm saving them money.
That's a great model. But that's a real win-win for sure.
Yeah. And then it stacks up a nice pipeline for me for Q4 when they may be a little bit more interested in making a change at the calendar year start. So it serves two evils for me, where it can pay a quick little bonus for doing some good RFP work for a client, and then gain some goodwill, and then go back and revisit the conversation in Q4 when they may be more apt to make a decision to transition.
I like it. So you fairly recently had a baby. Can you talk about balancing that with growing a business and networking to look for other opportunities?
Yeah, it's super easy. No, I mean, becoming a father it's been the single most rewarding thing in my life, and obviously my wife has been a tremendous champion of the household. She was a teacher, and so we had her take the year off this year for obvious reasons. Being a teacher is challenging at times, but it's definitely challenging right now when it's just a complete political mess. So she's been owning a lot of the brunt of being mom from, we'll call it 7 to 6 at night, and it's a good balancing act for her because she's like, okay, well, if I can do this really effectively and he can keep growing his business, then I probably don't have to go back to work next year. And so she's starting to see that her being such a good ally to me is allowing me to really focus on the business and grow the business. And that ultimately is probably going to lead to her not having to go back to school if she doesn't want to until, all of our kids are of kindergarten age. And if all of our kids are just like Mila, who's my daughter, we'll keep popping them out as long as they're as pleasant as her, man. She's been nothing but fantastic, and we've just got an excellent entry level baby.
That's awesome. I had one that was very challenging, and I talked my wife at the time into another one based on, well, it can't be worse than this.
That might be better though, because then the second one probably wasn't nearly as challenging, right?
No, exactly.
Right,
exactly.
So everyone tells me that the worst year of my life is going to be the first year of my second child's birth.
Okay.
And it's going to be because I can't. My wife is going to be so overburdened, and I can't ever. I'm never. She's never going to be as enthusiastic about the baby situation as we are right now, because everything's so new and
Sure.
everything's so different every day. You just see the development, which is so cool. And she's almost 6 months old now, so she's got this very fun, energetic personality, and
she smiles more than when she's just pooping.
Yes, yeah. Although it's funny how much they seem to get a thrill out of making you clean up after them. So yeah, it's not too bad. But again, I think that balancing all of that is essential to have a spouse that, one, encourage you to go into business for yourself, because I know that without her, I probably would have just kept leeching on to, again, Insperity was a great job for me. Made a lot of money. All my friends were like, what the hell are you thinking? You have this golden goose. You work 25 hours a week. You make 100, whatever the number is. and you golf a lot and you have no stress. And I was like, yeah, I want to do something else. And, so it was one of those head scratchers for a lot of my peer network. But my wife always got it because she had to hear about a lot of the tougher days where I'm just like, I can't find a way to be positive about what I'm doing right now.
Yep. Very, very, very good advice, and it's great to have a spouse that's so supporting for sure. I'd like to shift to networking because we've talked about it a little bit, and you did give a little bit of an overview or some of your kind of philosophy, but can you give me an overview of how you think about networking and how you like to go about it?
I go back to crediting Insperity here again. I feel like this has been a walking commercial for my previous employer, and I don't mean it to be that way, but
they're also your supply that you're selling.
Yeah, so. Yeah, they're also a good revenue producing entity for me now too. So I think that being in such a boring industry like Insperity in this PEO space, and again, it's a necessity, but it's a boring industry. There's nothing sexy about it. No one's super excited to put great benefits in place. They're excited to be able to keep their people and keep them happy and hopefully continue to build their revenue model. But because I was, doing something so boring, I would always be super curious about whatever everybody else was doing. And quickly you realize there's a million ways to make a dollar in this country, and there's just so much interesting things that people are doing out there. So I think that natural curiosity was what really lended itself to being very powerful for me, because you'd start seeing patterns after a while. And I really go back to my first, my green days of networking, and you're just trying to figure out how to be useful in some way. And rarely the answer to you being useful is your employer's product. And I think that a lot of people miss the boat on that because they're so focused on hitting a quota and kind of keeping themselves in the green from a employer perspective, that they don't realize that they could be more valuable just by making an introduction and being thoughtful about what somebody else is trying to accomplish. And what problems you can solve without really your own product. And I just think that's really how I focused on, building my network out is, well, Garth was a main key connector for me initially. And I realized quickly on that I can't try to sell to any of these people. I need to just create friendships and understand what they're doing, what they're trying to accomplish, who their client is, how they make money, and help them replicate that over and over again. And you'd be shocked at how easy it is to see your network facilitate that. And again, I came here from Ohio, and I've been networking in Charlotte for 5.5, 6 years. And, from the very get-go, I realized that, don't focus on your own company's product, focus on who you are, focus on what they're trying to accomplish. And eventually you start finding patterns to make a real impact on people that you had no idea were going to become as fruitful as they became. But then you look up and introductions I've made to you, they're business partners of yours. And you're like, wow, these people together have created something awesome. And you feel like you're a part of it, but you didn't have to really put in the actual hours to be a part of it.
It's funny you didn't articulate this, but it just made me think about it, and I hadn't really thought about it before. But you're right. It's not only don't try to sell these people, but don't try to network them. It's so often I take meetings with people and they say, and they ask for the meeting, and I take the meeting, and they say, what can I do for you? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really bad approach too, because now you're making me think about it. I didn't ask for this fucking meeting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And again, I don't word it that way when I talk to people, but it is, I think that a thoughtful approach where you say, I'm going to just put in, and everybody needs a bigger network.
Right.
Let's be honest. And I think that's what always impressed me about working with you, was that you weren't asking me what I needed. You were just, hey, I met this person. They're interesting. And if I said, no, I don't want to talk to him,
yeah, you don't talk to
you're going to keep them coming,
Right. And I think that I've been really lucky not to make bad introductions. I think that the networking scene is full of people that are literally throwing shit up against the wall and hoping that something sticks. And they're being completely, I don't know what the word is, but they're just not thinking about the time you're wasting, the time suck these conversations are. Like, you can't just introduce people for the sake of introducing people and hoping that something good comes out of it. You kind of have to have an identity or an idea of where that path's going to be, and help them kind of help that dialogue before it gets off the ground, and make sure that's going to be consumed the right way. But it kind of goes back to the concept of no one cares what you do, they care who you are. After you hang out with John Espy a couple of times, you're going to realize he's just a guy that likes to have good, candid conversations with genuine people that aren't afraid to admit their faults. And if you can just find that person in your network, you can make a valuable introduction. And obviously on the other side, that person's going to really appreciate meeting you.
Absolutely. I can't stress. I mean, it's at least 30 people that you've introduced me to the point now where even when you send me one where I don't immediately see, I don't roll my eyes anymore. I used to. I'd be like, but I knew, because you had introduced me to so many good people first. I'd like, even ones where I didn't make a connection at first, I'd be like, oh God. But then I'm like, I just need to do this because the guy has always come through for me. But now it's to the point where I don't even, it's just like, okay, yeah, I trust the process.
Yeah. You'll find the value. And again, like if I focused on people that were just trying to sell something to you, I know that I would piss you off very quickly, but I realize that there's going to be some sort of joint win there. And just focusing on creating win-win-win relationships as much as you can. And again, I think that I was talking to Jared Latch about this on his podcast a couple weeks ago. People in the sales seat are just so hyper-focused on what it is that they sell, and they completely dehumanize themselves to the point where people are like, do I want to talk to you, or do I want to talk to the brochure that you're going to hand me at the end of this conversation? Like, I stopped using business cards. I stopped doing all the things that are like, okay, people, I feel like the first time I met Garth, I handed him a business card and he's like, okay. And I'm like, okay, I probably shouldn't hand these things out anymore. It's completely off personal brand. And it just makes it feel like it's more of this business arrangement. Instead, it's really just people. It's really just friendship development is all networking really is.
Yeah, that's good advice on the business cards. For some reason, we still have them, but it's crazy to me. We've printed them at Defiance, but I'm like, this is what LinkedIn is for, right?
Right, right. Yeah, people know who you are before they meet with you. Yeah, I promise.
Exactly. It's crazy to me. So are there some mistakes you've made yourself in networking and had to kind of course correct with, or?
Occasionally, I'll make an introduction that, again, I feel like this Zoom era of networking has created more of a problem than ever persisted before. Because when you're sitting across from somebody and you're having an hour-long conversation that's completely uninhibited by your email inbox or your phone or all the other things that are going to distract you from a Zoom call, you can get a pretty good understanding of the person you're talking to, their general DNA, what makes them tick, who they are as a person. And you can draw that line pretty effortlessly. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess in my world, it just becomes pretty. You just start hearing things that remind you of other people, and you're like, God, these people really do good talking to each other. But in the Zoom era has definitely created a lot more swings and misses than I've ever had before. My hit rate I feel like would usually be very strong, and early on in my networking days, I would be very diligent about getting feedback from client or from partners and saying, hey, what sucked? I just introduced you to 5 people. Tell me 2 of them that were terrible and why. I won't replicate that again. And so I feel like now that we're doing everything through Zoom, it's a lot harder to get to the meat of who these people are and who you're setting up with a conversation with somebody else, because you didn't really meet with them. You met with them, but when you introduce them to somebody else, you don't know if they're going to go in with this giant sales commission breath that you don't want to deal with, or they're going to represent you the same way that they represented themselves when they talked to you initially.
Yeah, and I think Zoom works really well with people you already know. Right. I think you still have to have the first face-to-face to really know somebody, and then that makes the Zoom more productive. And I think that phone calls become much more productive after I've met with you and had a couple of Zoom calls. But if I just lead with phone calls, it's just really hard to really understand somebody, especially when you're going to be multiplying this through the network and making all sorts of introductions. I could see where that's challenging.
And I've echoed that through a lot of my networking channels, that this whole pandemic has been a massive efficiency creator for existing relationships, which is part of why I attribute my pandemic success to the fact that nobody else was really displacing my relationships, because you're probably trying to do it through Zoom. And if you're like me, you overwrite every single Zoom call with the next Zoom call. And by the end of the day, you're like, who the hell did I talk to today? And what were their names? And what the hell do they do? And people will be like, hey, you introduced me to this person. I'm like, who? And I'm trying to place it. But if I sit here and talk to you face to face, I won't forget this shit for 2 or 3 years. And if I do it through Zoom, I'll forget you in 2 or 3 days, 2 or 3 hours, depending on how crazy my life is that day. So I think it definitely is a great catalyst for maintaining existing relationships. It's a heck of a uphill climb for creating new ones.
Yep. Do you have a system in place to make sure you stay in touch with people that help to build your network, or are you just good at keeping up with it?
Honestly, people ask me that all the time, and because there's a lot of serendipitous, timely conversations that I will have, but there's no science to it at all. It's just something. I could be driving down the road and see something that reminds me of somebody, and shoot them a text and be like, hey, what's going on? Let's catch up for a coffee, drink, beer, whatever.
How often you do that, and it actually is the exact right time that you were supposed to talk.
Oh yeah, that's why people. I think it's so crazy. I'm like, I am not a data scientist when it comes to, or disciplined person when it comes to inputting when I follow up with people or how I engage with people. It's literally just something comes up that reminds me of somebody. I just had one of these happen yesterday where a new resume popped up. A guy just started a company that's very similar to this new market manager lead, or down here in the Carolinas, that's coming down from Ohio. I was like, this seems like something right up this guy's alley. He probably won't take it because he just started his company, but he probably knows somebody that would love this thing. But it's just like that. You just start kind of connecting dots, and I wish that I had some sort of system that I could tell people to replicate, but it's really just I've thought about this reminded me of somebody else, and now all of a sudden I'm making an introduction, and it's turning into something productive for everybody involved.
One thing that often triggers me to reach out to somebody is just if I get on LinkedIn and just look at the feed for just scroll through my feed for a little bit, I see somebody's doing something, and then I say, oh wow, I need to make this connection or that one.
Yeah, I use LinkedIn as I'd say LinkedIn ends up being, and although LinkedIn has become a political Facebook, I still use LinkedIn in a way to trigger those synopsises that we're trying to connect people that we haven't talked to in a while. And it's amazing because I have so many more business friends now than I have like friends that I came down here with, and the people that have just continued to multiply. Ohio is just a pipeline for Charlotte, as many of you well know. But you realize that I haven't talked to this person in so long, and the pandemic, because time was just such a abstract concept during the pandemic. I feel like you don't realize how long it's been since you talked to somebody, or how long it's been since you reached out to somebody, and you'll see something pop through LinkedIn, and that's usually a triggering moment for me to say, hey, I haven't talked to you in a while. Shoot them a text and be like, hey, I hope everything's well, and try to understand where they're at. And again, if you can make some good low-hanging fruit introductions, I'm going to do it.
Yep. So one thing I've observed, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you're actually fairly introverted in spite of how much you get out there and mix it up. Is that a correct observation?
I'd say that I'm not someone that's going to go speak to a crowd by any stretch. I don't feel like I feel all that comfortable being in front of a giant spotlight. And I think that I am incredibly comfortable in a group of 2 or 3 guys, 4 guys, 4 people that I can just have a good general dialogue with and kind of bounce ideas with. So I think that...
but you would get exhausted talking to a room of 20 people.
I think I would get uncomfortable talking to a room at a time. I think that as soon as you put a PowerPoint behind me, I will fumble it like crazy, which is so weird because I am generally okay and comfortable talking in like a group setting where I can be mostly the conversation lead. But the bigger the group, the more formal it feels, the less it feels like me. So yeah, that definitely hits the nail on the head when it comes to introvert versus extrovert. But I think that most of my network would think I'm extroverted, but it's because I've had so many one-on-one conversations with people.
So have you actively done things to overcome those introvert tendencies, or is it just you just keep chugging along because you know it's the right thing to do, and you just naturally get more and more comfortable with being so outgoing?
Yeah, I was gonna say it's something that the more you do anything, obviously, the more comfortable you get, the more you understand what the most likely outcomes are going to be, the most likely responses are going to be, the more comfortable you are in any kind of given situation. So I feel like it was just a massive amounts of inserts in the last 5 to 7 years that I feel very comfortable in any conversation with anybody, regardless of how sophisticated they think they are, or regardless of how mundane my solution may be. I feel like I can bring value in most conversations, and I've proven it pretty consistently. So that's been more of my catalyst for comfort in those conversations.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important point. Some of the best public speakers I know are actually painfully introverted. I mean, but they put themselves out there and they do it, and they become very, very good speakers, even though if you ask them, they're like, oh, I'm exhausted. After the conference moderating the panel, I just want to go take a nap. I just want to get to the hotel room and sleep. But you put yourself out there, and those people tend to be not only really good public speakers, but also leaders too. There's a lot of really good leaders who have introvert tendencies.
What I found is the anticipation is always worse than the act in all settings. And I mean, this happens to me all the time. I feel like when I have to do public speaking stuff, I'll sit up at night fretting it, anxiety about it. But when it actually happens, it doesn't feel anything near the pedestal I put it on the front end is so much worse than the actual result.
Yep. And I think that's true of so many things. I get stressed when I do a podcast. I enjoy doing this podcast. I always have a good time with it, but I'm always stressed leading up to it, just thinking about what could go wrong.
What's Jeff going to say?
What's Jeff going to say? Is Jeff going to bring a good drink to have with our bourbon? But then when I go do it, I'm like, oh, I'm really glad I did that. And I think any new skill that you learn, or relatively new skill, I think that's true. It used to be that way with CrossFit. Every single CrossFit workout I did, I was just like, oh my God, this thing's going to kill me. And then you get through a couple of them and you build a confidence, and then you kind of break through it.
Yeah, I agree. There's something very alive you feel doing these uncomfortable things. Because, I mean, obviously we can all execute extremely well with the thing that we do well. And mine happens to be, again, a very boring thing, but it's a very necessary thing. And that's something that doesn't really build a whole lot of calluses whenever you're doing something you know you do well. But whenever you're doing something that makes you uncomfortable, you feel a heck of a lot more alive, and you feel a heck of a lot more fulfilled after you do it. Reminds me, by the way, I was having lunch with Mr. Gary Fry yesterday, and he's recovering from, I think it was a shoulder injury.
Yeah, I was with him. We were doing Murph every day, which Murph is a brutal workout that he completely obliterates me in every time. For the record, I think I can take Gary in some barbell related things, but in body weight, the dude crushes me. And every Monday we were working out, and all of a sudden he texted me and was like, my shoulder's injured, and I can't do anything. And I actually haven't talked to him since then, and have been meaning to.
So he told me to say hello to you, and he said that to tell John I'm ready to start whooping his butt in the Murph again.
he kicks my ass in it.
Yeah, I mean, the guy is as a body scientist. Now he's just great people and just general great energy all around. And I figured you guys had to be buddies. I mentioned you yesterday when I was at lunch with him. He's like, oh. He's like, yeah, I whooped John's butt in the Murph a couple of years. Yeah, when I think he did his first Murph with you or something like that. And he's just really good people.
No, yeah, Gary's a great guy. And I've only got a few more questions that I want to cover. But did COVID have any impact on your business? I mean, it sounds like you've thrived during COVID, but what was the impact? And can you kind of walk me through? Because a lot of people, I think it meant one thing in March, and then another thing in June, and then another thing in September, and another thing now.
Sure. I'll tell you exactly what happened. March, no one was doing anything. So that's kind of birthed this whole contract negotiation model that's going to have some sort of contingency-based compensation tied to it. And again, that's more a short-term mindset, which I generally don't endorse, but during the circumstances, I just felt like I had to. In basically March through June, it was crickets. I mean, so many good proposals out there. You have to think these PEOs are so far behind on their Wall Street number that they're as motivated as they've ever been to put great proposals in front of their clients.
We signed with you in March, right?
Yeah.
And I was floored by the pricing that we got. It was amazing.
Yeah, and that's what I saw. Ubiquitous. I mean, obviously, in your guys' situation was a startup, and it was a little bit more unique. But a lot of the deals I'm working are people that have existing medical spends that they're spending in some sort of areas, and or they're trying to pivot PEOs if I'm getting pulled into those conversations. But by the time July came around, which is normally an absolutely dead time in the industry, I don't think I'll ever have a July, August like I had in 2020. Because you had all this pipeline that was sitting there with great deals waiting to be had, and you had people that weren't making decisions because of the PPP forgiveness stuff. They wanted to make sure that, okay, if I make a transition, is it going to F me for this PPP forgiveness? And the reality is, it was more of just that, that normal latent scar tissue that people will hold on to, like the what if equation. By the time July came around, it was just the floodgates were open. People were getting super microscopic in these areas that they're generally procrastinating on. Benefit renewals are usually what triggers most people looking at conversations with me. But because they had extra time on their hands, they're working from home, they weren't dealing with as much juggling that they may have been doing before that. They ended up having a lot. Most of my biggest deals were happening in Q3 for this year, which I wasn't expecting, but I'm obviously super grateful that they were being more proactive and intentional about being understanding of what they're spending money on, how they can save money, how they could bring more to their employees. And all of that was kind of perpetuated by the fact that 2020 was a walking HR commercial, really. All the things that we kind of sell when I was Jeff at Insperity, all the what ifs were like, what's happening? That definitely perpetuates the excitement for this co-employment relationship that's going to shift a lot of the risk of having employees. How do you deal with these unique and delicate situations? And how do you have a partner that's going to really see things through with you and have skin in the game? And the industry as a whole, I feel like, got a giant amount of public praise because of how they were, because of how adaptive they were to the ever-changing landscape of employment here in the United States.
Yeah, it's interesting talking to all these different businesses and how COVID impacted them. I think the one consistent theme is that nothing got done from March till May or June.
Yeah, I want to know. I want to know who was killing it from March to June, because everybody. Yeah, I felt the same way. Nobody was producing any kind of uptick in revenue during that time, but I got to imagine somebody was killing it during that time.
Yeah, I'm sure there was some. I mean, Zoom was killing it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But we recently had Stu Brower in here, and he owns a gym and a couple of other businesses related to gyms, and he said from March until about June there was just nothing. He just wasn't allowed to be open, and luckily for him, he generates a lot of video and audio content, so he was able to pivot a little bit towards a more virtual model. I did talk to one lady, owns a yoga studio, who had maxed out at 52 clients that could fit in the studio. Right. COVID hits, she shuts it down. She had been trying to come up with like a virtual experience, but she wasn't happy with it. And she's like, well, let's just turn it on. This is all we have. And for the same price was getting 150, 160 customers coming on. So she did fine with it. But I think most
it's funny how your entrepreneurs will diminish the value of something that they don't see, but other people will. That's awesome for her.
Yeah. Well, and I asked her, I was like, so when it comes back and your studio's open, are you getting rid of the digital? And she's like, oh no. She's like, I could have 1,000 customers on digital. And I could have 1 million.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's the key to this whole 2020 was, I was expecting like 2019 was such a good like entry point into entrepreneurial. Like I started paying myself W-2 income in February 2020. And so basically I went 12 months without any kind of paid income at all. And so I was super excited by the fact that I was paying myself, less than a year or almost a year into it. And
that's about how long we went at level, by the way. It's that's a pretty healthy amount of time to not be paid. But,
right.
But eventually you need to be paid, right?
Right. Yeah. And again, like the fact that the Mila was on the way and like the things that I knew I needed, and the business, again, because it creates very sticky clients and the revenue is extremely predictable. I felt like I was at a point where I could start paying myself, but yeah, in 2019, I was just super grateful that I was able to get to that point. And in 2020, it was just like, I think I was ready to hire. Honestly, in 2020, in Q1, I was going to make a couple of hires in the sales seat. And I just decided let's just focus on being a producer for my company for the next, 12 months. And it's boded well. And now I was actually able to get some PPP money, which I felt like was I didn't realize that was a thing from people like me that were in this solopreneur seat, but it was, and it's allowing me to pay for his salary for the next couple months, which gives me a lot of optimism to see whether or not his production is going to warrant his salary.
Hope he's listening and feeling a little bit of heat.
No. Sorry, I would, yeah. No, I'm not expecting him to have the same sort of hockey stick production that I did. Obviously, I was super calculated with when I left and knowing what my pipeline was going to look like before I was exiting.
Yep. So, you mentioned when we were talking before we got on, you wish you had been able to invest in a company that you were working with. Do you do any early stage investing?
I will. I mean, the reality is when you're running a very a very predictable revenue model company like this, like I want to invest in other companies. I want to invest and I think that the long-term path to our conversation 10 years from now will probably be that Jeff's invested in a couple of startups that he believes in, that he believes that his network can support and satisfy in some way. And my portfolio will not just be something that is boring as HR and benefits, but it's a great backbone to the need for financing these other endeavors. So yeah, currently, do I? No. Will I? Ultimately, yes, I'd love to. And I think that a lot of these early stage companies, I'd love to hear about what they're doing, what problems they're solving, and how much I believe those problems will persist into the future and have some real scale tied to them.
Well, your networking will serve you well there. I mean, that game is won and lost by the network and just seeing the right opportunities for sure. So.
Right. Yeah. And again, I think that the networking is something that I am more intrinsically motivated by than the actual production of my company. I think, my company in the long run will probably be 10 to 20 different offices around the US and have a whole bunch of support here out of the Charlotte market that's going to be more towards retention and really making sure that those reps that are bringing in stuff in Dallas or Denver or Columbus or wherever the heck they are that revenue is sticky and it's going to be paying them for time, time after time. That's going to be my value back to those reps. But
it's interesting you mentioned Columbus. I'm going to go off on a tangent here just because we're near the end. But are you from Columbus? You mentioned Ohio. I'm geographically challenged when it comes to Ohio. Are you Cleveland?
I'm
Cincinnati?
Canton, Ohio, which is
I flew up there for the in 2008 because Darryl Green and Art Monk were two Washington football team.
I was probably at that.
players.
I was probably at the Hall of Fame there in Canton, Ohio.
Oh, we took over that game.
Yeah.
We played in the game and we had our two best players of all time make the Hall of Fame at the same time.
Right.
So that is not that close to Columbus. No. But it's funny that you mentioned Columbus because I hear, I obviously everybody knows about Cleveland and Cincinnati, but I hear a lot more about Columbus. It sounds like it's might be more the future of Ohio.
Right. I wouldn't disagree with that. Cleveland's economy was predicated on LeBron for a little bit through the recession. And then basically he was the one that kept basically bars, restaurants, and all that stuff open inside of the Cleveland landscape. In Columbus, obviously, you got the Buckeyes that are right there. You have a very similar demographic city that's got a lot of youth to it, a lot of innovation to it inside of, in a lot better weather in Columbus versus Cleveland, which seems counterintuitive. But Cleveland's on the lake, so you get a ton of lake effect snow, and it's this time of year, it's snow, melt, mud, snow, melt, mud, and it's all gray skies the whole way through. So it doesn't really lead itself to be an all of that attractive spot to be. But I think Columbus could really be a market that really resembles Charlotte in a lot of ways. It's small enough that you can make an impact, and your personal brand can really take you a long way. And they're creating enough innovative companies that could be very good fits for that whole conversation about bringing employers on at 5 employees and watching them grow to being 100 employee groups and seeing a 20x revenue multiple on a client in a relatively short amount of time.
Very cool. Yeah, I know very little about Ohio, but it just seems like I hear way more about Columbus when people are talking about quality of life, and all these other things.
Oh yeah, there's a lot to. Again, I like Columbus a lot. If I was going to live in Ohio, I'm more of a Browns fan. I'm a huge Buckeye fan, but the Browns. I was there for Week 17 this year. We made the playoffs for the first time in my lifetime, basically. So I went to the game in Week 17.
That had to be cool because America was pulling for you guys. You guys in Buffalo became everybody's favorite team, I feel like.
I've never seen so many grown men cry at a sporting event with their kids that were 18, 20 years old that have never even sniffed the playoff berth. So it was awesome, tons of fun, and I think that Cleveland's really positioned well for a lot of positive growth when it comes to the sports scene there. But Columbus, I think, is more of the economic driver of Ohio, and one that I would be more interested in investing in resources in Columbus. And it's only about a 2-hour drive, so it's not terribly difficult to manage both markets with some sort of effectiveness.
Is one of them where 77? Like you can take 77.
Yeah.
All
So
the way
70. No, I've lived off 77 my whole life. So I grew up on Canton, which is right off 77. I went to Akron, which is right about maybe 20 miles north of Canton for college. And I hightailed it down 77 right here to Charlotte, which is again a place I'm extremely excited to call home, and a place that I am always bringing more with me. I had a cousin move here this year. I had another couple buddies move down this year. So every year it seems like a couple of extra Ohioans really take their head out of the gutter and realize that you don't have to live in the grays of November through May, which you get for Ohio for that winter period.
I had a friend who was in economic development, and he would say to people, "Oh, like from the north," he's like, "Why don't you come visit us in February and we'll go play golf?" Which the climate is something that we forget about. It's such a big influencer on why people come to places.
Right.
What do you think? I'm interested in your take because I came to Charlotte in 2004 traveling, and I moved here in 2005 and built a house in 2006. I've seen a lot of change in the city. You came much more recently, as you've said.
Mm-hmm.
How would you characterize the changes going on in Charlotte?
I think that what's exciting about Charlotte is that it's a developing culture. Like a lot of these cities, whether it's Nashville or Atlanta or wherever you're at and around the country, already had to have a very established culture of what they are. Charlotte's kind of birthing that right now in a lot of different ways. And obviously the pandemic puts a bit of a, I was talking to Garth about this the other day, that a TBS version, which basically means you ever watch TBS movies whenever they put R-rated movies on TBS and they don't show any of the good scenes and they don't say any of the bad words. But basically right now we're living in a TBS version of Charlotte, but the whole like ecosystem of what Charlotte's going to be is still being kind of developed and evolving. So I think that's super exciting to be a part of. And who knows what that's going to be, what the linchpins of the city is going to be. But the breweries are obviously been a fast track of like what they were when I first moved here 7 years ago. I mean,
there's what now, 45 of them, I think? Or?
When I moved here, there was probably 6, 7. I mean, it was very little. So they're growing, multiplying dramatically. I was talking with the OMB master brewer the other day, and he's like, if you look at a per capita brewery, like in Asheville versus Charlotte, we could seemingly do 20x what we're doing right now and still be able to sustain that. And I think could be a very cool culture piece of what Charlotte ends up being. But I think, people that are moving here are walking into something that's ever evolving and ever changing. And it's not just some, it's not a permanent fixture the way that some of these other cities have already kind of tied their sails to a certain type of culture.
I agree. One of the things I loved coming here is that they're very the not powers that be. I hate that term, but there's a group of people who are very connected within Charlotte who open their arms to outsiders and bring them in and not try to force them out. And I don't know that that's true in a lot of cities.
Right.
I had Dave Dalton on the show who his father and maybe his grandfather did very well with textiles, and then Dave did very well with printed circuit boards and advanced manufacturing in Mooresville. And the minute I met him, I just felt like he feels a duty to keep people like me here. And in talking to him, it was very clear that I think that's been the consistent reason that Charlotte's been able to invent itself. I mean, it was a gold rush city for a little bit, and then it was a trading post, and then it was a textile town, and then now it's a banking town. But it doesn't matter what it's going to be next. It's going to be something.
Right.
And I think it's that openness and that, hey, I'm going to try new things. I'm going to embrace new people. I think the size right now plays to its advantage.
Oh, absolutely.
Big time. Because it is at the perfect size where you can literally come in and meet anybody that you need to meet.
Right. Within 2 or 3 handshakes, you can meet everybody you want to meet. And I think that there's, again, I think there's just the way that like South End is blowing up, and South End will eventually be the center of the entertainment.
I think it already is, honestly.
Me and my wife, we went down there on Wednesday. We took our baby down, and we were just walking around. And I was like, geez, I'm like, if we ever moved here, we would never move. Like we would just love the vibrancy that you get down there, and it just feels so comfortable. But there's everything you could ever want within a half-mile radius, and it's fantastic. And I think that as that continues to blossom and bloom, that will be the thing that people travel here for, which I think is interesting about South End is that they don't really have hotels.
Well, they've got one.
But
maybe 2.
But like if you're gonna come to Charlotte,
there's
like,
a Holiday Inn Express. I'm sure of that, and then there's one more, I think, boutique that might have opened. But there's nothing. Uptown, on the other hand, has what? What do you think? 40 hotels.
But why would anybody come to Charlotte to visit Uptown? Like that's the thing about locals. Like why would you come to Charlotte and go stay Uptown when you can stay? And again, like we're talking about the stone's throw away in South End, but like I think South End could blossom with the hospitality industry and. Could be a spot that most people want to be whenever they're coming to visit the city. And I don't know that Charlotte will ever be the tourist city that, Nashville is. But I think that when I was walking around there, man, I'm just like, this just feels like a very marketable place for people to be able to come visit, feel comfortable. And also Charlotte's got great proximity to a lot of places that you want to be, which is really the biggest draw I tell to Ohio people. It's not the weather, although the weather is much better, but it's more about the proximity that you can be anywhere you want to be on the weekend and not feel like you had to drive 10 hours to be there.
Oh yeah, my fiance and I routinely drive to Asheville, to Blowing Rock, to Charleston. It's anywhere you want to go. It's if you want to golf, if you're into golf, Pinehurst is not far away, right? There's so many things so close to us. It's cool to be a part of it. I wouldn't call Charlotte a startup. It's a very established city who's been here since the Revolutionary War. But it feels like a startup. When I started traveling here, I told people there's just an energy in Charlotte that I don't feel in many places. You feel it in a certain way in Palo Alto. You feel it in a certain way in Austin. But those are much more established cities. There's just something about Charlotte that's very, very appealing. And it's funny that you mentioned Garth, because I think he's the prime example of what's right with Charlotte. Garth, very successful, lived in San Francisco, great sales guy, was on my podcast, been a good friend and mentor to me through the years. And he just decides that he needs to move. He said, why am I in San Francisco? He'd already started a very successful company. And he said, I want to go look to the East Coast. He's from Vermont?
Yeah, I don't want to say exactly which state because I always blend them all together.
I think it's Vermont, though. Okay. But it's one of those Northeast states, New Hampshire.
Yeah, sure.
One of those Tom Brady, New England Patriot fan cities or states. But Garth looks in D.C., he looks in Atlanta, and he didn't like either one. He's like, I'm not moving back to the Northeast. It's just too cold.
Right.
But he assumed that he wanted the cultural amenities of DC or Atlanta. And when he saw the traffic and he saw everything else that you had to deal with, somebody convinced him to go to Charlotte. And when he did, he instantly fell in love with it. And just, he might have even bought a house or signed a lease while he was visiting Charlotte. He liked it that much. But I think that's a testament to what's right with Charlotte, is it's open. It invites people like that to come. I mentioned Dave Dalton and what his family and business interests did to help introduce me into the ecosystem. And I think that cities that do that have a very interesting future for sure, because they can attract people like Garth, and they can keep people like you and me. They can keep people in the city.
Right.
So I'm very bullish on our prospects.
When I first moved down here, they talked about the good old boy network down here all the time.
But to me, that's Columbia and Richmond, Virginia. That's not.
No. I feel like there's been way too many Midwesterners and New Yorkers and stuff moved down here that have kind of changed that whole outlook. But I think that it's for the better, though, because what it does is it welcomes a whole new herd of that next generation that's going to continue to flock down into this area, which brings tons of talent, which brings tons of employers, which brings tons of economic growth. And I'm so excited that it's such a small city right now that, again, you can meet anybody you want to meet by handshaking two people that know a decent amount of people here. And you can also, what's also beautiful about it is that you can't really compromise your integrity without getting a terrible name for yourself very quickly. So people have to be very mindful about short-term gain thought process and being aware that whatever you do today can leak itself out through the network of Charlotte very quickly. And so you have to be very mindful that
I think you just made a crazy important point in my perspective. And recently it's become clear because I've had a couple of business opportunities that came my way that I got excited about. And then I asked people and they were like, pump the brakes on this one. And this might not be what you think it is, because you cannot do somebody the wrong way in Charlotte and get away with it in a way that you probably could in New York or Singapore or Shanghai or London and bigger cities for sure. So I think that's a great point that you make there.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Yeah, it's. Again, I think this city is lend itself to be a perfect fit for like my business model. Again, if I was going to replicate it again in new territories, Dallas wouldn't have been the most logical choice because it's probably 5x the market share.
Great city, by the way, though.
Yeah, absolutely great city, and I obviously have a great relationship there. But Nashville would have been fantastic. Raleigh would have been fantastic. Atlanta is big, but it still would have been fantastic because my wife's from there and I go there all the time. So it would have helped for some of those personal reasons. But Charlotte's kind of got that perfect blend of big enough to be important, but small enough to be understood at the entry level.
Very cool. Well, look, Jeff, I appreciate you doing this. I don't know why we waited this long to do it. I'd like to have you on again. Before we leave, is there anything we haven't talked about that we should hit on?
Not that I can think of, man. But you've been feeding me bourbon this whole time, so you're asking me to think deep right now, and you've given me a layer of challenge with this Angel's Envy.
I love it. It's funny. I had Bobby Robin. Do you know Bobby? By the way, he started in IntelliDoc. He used to own a law firm. He got acqui-hired by a bigger law firm, and then we acquired his contract management software. Really cool guy. And I poured the bourbon, Angel's Envy, for him, and then I poured the rye, and I said, "Tell me which one you like." He's like, "I don't know, John. I don't know." He looks at me. He goes, "What do you think?" And I was like, "Well, most people like the rye better." And he said, "Well, I'm going to have to disagree. I like the bourbon better." And I said, "Well, you're entitled to your opinion. You're wrong." But it was funny because about like 10 minutes later, after sipping on the rye, he actually said it was better. So have you done a taste test between the two?
I haven't tasted them both. I mean, we can do it here live on air.
So you've been drinking the rye. Let's get a solo cup. Thank you, Todd. So I think the bourbon is very good. I don't want to color your thoughts, but
it sounds like you're leading the witness here, John.
I am leading the witness. It's my show, though. I can do that. So that's the bourbon. Go taste the rye.
I mean, the bourbon's definitely got a nice smoky punch to the nostrils.
Yeah, and in some ways it's smoother, which I think a lot of people think that smoother tastes better, but then it's spicier. It's not as smooth. There's no doubt that is not as smooth of a drink.
Yeah, you're right. Now I'm like getting a little bit of backup from it. Yeah, no, I agree. I'm more of a bourbon person in general, so I usually don't do the rye stuff, but I would drink absent this conversation.
I think they're both very good whiskeys to drink, so I don't think you can go wrong with it. But I happen to be right, and Bobby is wrong. The rye is better.
So why is the rye on the table then?
Well, I'm a very giving man, Jeff.
You cater to all taste.
Yes. No, I'm saying the rye is better. So the rye is here because it's better, but I like to bring the bourbon because most people taste the bourbon and they're like, "Oh, that's great." And then I let them taste the rye. And they're like, "Oh, okay." Because it's much rarer to get the rye for whatever reason.
So that's more expensive tasting.
It's more expensive. I don't. Todd may know better, but I want to say that I pay typically $59 for a bottle of the bourbon, and maybe $89 for the rye.
Jeez,
so they're not expensive bottles.
They're gonna be marketing this after this little taste test.
If they only know how many listeners I have, Jeff. Well, look, brother, this has been great, man. Thank you so much. Congratulations on all the success. It sounds like we can look forward to many, many more Wanners.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, again, it's all contingent upon them following the Mila model, which is my first daughter, which is very easy. Now, I don't expect that to happen here on after, but yeah, my wife would love to have as many as we'll have, but we'll see.
All right. Well, again, thanks for joining me. Have a good weekend. We'll talk soon.
All right, brother.
All right. Cheers.